Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's plan aims to tackle two things: market newcomers and housing supply. Labor has promised to spend $10 billion to build 100,000 new homes, which can be bought with a 5% deposit. That's only available to first home buyers who earn less than $125,000 for singles or $200,000 annually for couples. Labor hopes to have construction begin in the 2026 to 2027 financial year, with homes complete the following year. Meanwhile, the Coalition is targeting market newcomers and housing demand. Opposition leader Peter Dutton says his government will allow first-time buyers of newly built homes to deduct interest on their mortgage repayments from their income tax. The deduction would be capped to the first $650,000 of their mortgage, and it would only be available to owner-occupiers for the first 5 years of the loan. It would also be means tested at $175,000 for singles and $250,000 for couples. Mr Dutton says if elected, the Coalition would introduce the policy within 100 days of forming government. He's also promising further cuts to immigration to help ease housing demand. So let's get some analysis now on the two parties' housing policies. Independent economist Saul Eslake joins me now from Hobart. And Saul, let's take a closer look here. So let's go to Peter Dutton's policy first. He's proposed that interest repayments, payments on up to $650,000 on a mortgage would be tax deductible for first-time buyers. This has been implemented overseas in a similar form. What happened there?
Well, let's remember where it is implemented overseas, it's because capital gains on the sale of homes are subject to tax. That's particularly in the United States, or in some European countries like Switzerland and the Netherlands. People are liable for tax on the imputed or notional rent that they pay to themselves for using the houses which they own. So interest is a legitimate tax deduction against a form of taxable income. That's the same rationale for negative gearing that applies to investors in Australia, that they are borrowing money and paying interest on it in order to acquire an asset which will ultimately yield a taxable capital gain. But no one's proposing, least of all the Coalition, that capital gains on homes bought by first home buyers who take up this scheme would be subject to tax. So it is just a straight handout. It is in effect a significant reduction in the after-tax interest rate that these people will pay on their mortgages. And we know from what's happened when interest rates have fallen significantly during the GFC or more recently during COVID, that people respond to that not by paying less in interest, but by taking out much bigger mortgages, which push up the price of housing. So this policy, especially when combined with the Coalition's other major housing policy, the so-called Super for Housing policy, which will allow people to take up to 40% of their superannuation savings, subject to a cap of $50,000, and put that towards the purchase of a home. That's really a souped-up first home owners grant scheme, but using individuals' money rather than taxpayers' money to pay for it. This will supercharge housing prices, and so in that sense it will actually make the problem of housing affordability worse. And in reality we've got 60 years of evidence going back to the first homeowners grant scheme introduced by the Menzies government in 1964, which shows unequivocally and unambiguously that anything that allows Australians to spend more on housing, which the Coalition's two principal policies would do, results in more expensive housing and a smaller proportion of the population owning that housing. In other words, there might be a few people who can arrange their affairs to take personal advantage of this scheme, but the overwhelming result of it will be to enrich those who already own houses at the expense of the smaller proportion of the population who don't.
And Saul, the fact that this is limited to new builds, does that soften any of the blow that you're talking about there?
Well, it certainly does limit the impact that it will have on house prices overall, but the Coalition says that one of the effects of this policy will be to skew demand from first home buyers towards new housing. Now, that may well be right, I'm not arguing against that, but in the absence of a sudden increase in the supply of new housing, the result of increasing demand will be to push up prices, and then there is normally some kind of flow-on between changes in the price of new houses and changes in the price of established houses, because to some extent one is a substitute for the other. So this will spill over, as it normally does. As a result of this, the Coalition argues that an increase in the demand for new housing will automatically somehow stimulate an increase in supply from builders. I doubt that that's the case, and in particular, I doubt that it will happen as quickly as the increase in demand will flow from making interest payments on these mortgages tax deductible. So I think it's pretty clear and unarguable that the principal result of this will be an increase in house prices. Moreover, I suspect that it will be very difficult for the Coalition, if they win the election and the subsequent one, to turn this off after 5 years. They will come under pressure to widen it to first home buyers of established houses, and ultimately to widen it to all home buyers. So this could be the tip of a very large iceberg, or the thin edge of a very large wedge.
So let's go to Labor's policy now. Anthony Albanese pledged that a re-elected Labor government would expand this program to allow first homeowners to avoid lenders' mortgage insurance by having just a 5% deposit, so sidestepping that traditional 20% deposit. Do you have concerns over that policy?
Yeah, I do, although they're not as big as the concerns I have about the Coalition's policy. And anything that allows people to pay less for a mortgage, which this policy will do, will result in people borrowing more money, and that will in turn result in pushing prices up. This will be of more limited effect than the Coalition's policy, because I think fewer people will take advantage of it. But the government does concede, at least they're honest enough to concede, that it will put some upward pressure on prices. They're just disputing that it will be a substantial upward impact on prices. And I guess that comes down to what your definition of substantial is, and there isn't one on which everyone agrees, but it will put some upward pressure on prices. The other saving grace, I guess, from the government's proposal is that they're also proposing to put $10 billion down over 8 years to increase the supply of housing for first home buyers by speeding up the production, the construction of new houses on, particularly, they say, vacant or underutilised government land. Now, that's a bigger program than the one which the Coalition announced a few months ago, to make grants to states and others to put in the infrastructure that's required for new suburban housing estates. I mean, that will help boost supply, but the government's proposals, in part because there's twice as much money in it, will boost supply by more. So overall, the government's proposals will have a smaller impact in continuing house price inflation than the Coalition's policies will, but they will both have the effect of enriching those who already own homes at the expense of those who don't or who can't.
Independent economist Saul Eslake, thank you for your insights on this.
Thank you for having me.